Let me ask you something before we get into this story. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night and had absolutely no idea why? No sound, no movement, nothing obvious. Just your eyes opening in the dark and your body already tense, already alert, like something deep inside you, something older than logic, had decided you needed to be awake right now. Most of the time, it's nothing. You tell yourself that. You roll over, close your eyes, and eventually drift back off. But what if one night, it wasn't nothing? What if the thing that woke you up was real, and it was standing just inches away from you, on the other side of a wall so thin you could have reached through it? That is exactly what happened to Daniel Mercer on the night of September 14th, 2011. And by the time Daniel fully understood what he had been sleeping next to that night, a woman was missing. Investigators across 3 states were quietly connecting dots they didn't want to connect. And a man with pale eyes and a very neat notebook was sitting in a room answering questions with a calm smile on his face. This is that story, and I need you to pay attention to every detail, because the details are what make this one so deeply disturbing. Daniel Mercer was 38 years old and had been camping alone since he was in his early 20s. He was not a thrill seeker. He was not chasing adventure. He was a quiet, methodical man who worked as a high school science teacher in Little Rock, Arkansas, and for him, solo camping was simply the purest form of rest he had ever found. No notifications, no obligations. Just him, a fire, and the sound of the world doing what it had been doing long before humans arrived to complicate everything. He knew the Ouachita National Forest well. He had been coming here for years. The forest covers nearly 2 million acres across western Arkansas and southeastern Oklahoma, dense pine and hardwood, winding rivers, remote trails that can go hours without seeing another human being. That remoteness was the entire point for Daniel. He didn't come here to run into people. He came here to disappear from them. On the evening of September 14th, he pulled his truck off a gravel access road deep in the forest and parked at a small trailhead lot. There were no other vehicles. He loaded his pack, locked the truck, and hiked about a quarter-mile in to a flat clearing he had used before. Good ground, natural wind cover from a dense cluster of pines on the north side, and a shallow creek about 40 feet to the east that he could use for water. The kind of campsite that takes years of experience to find and you never quite tell anyone else about. He set up his tent, got a fire going, cooked a simple meal, and sat back in his camp chair with a cup of coffee. The temperature was dropping pleasantly. The sky was cloudless and enormous. He described this moment later to investigators, to the journalist who eventually covered this case. He described it as one of the most peaceful moments of his life. He used that phrase more than once. One of the most peaceful moments of his life. And he always said it with a particular expression, like the memory of that peace made what came after feel even worse by contrast. At around 9 p.m., a light appeared on the hill above his campsite. He noticed it casually at first. The registered campsite 9 on the forest map was about 600 feet up the slope from where he had set up. When Daniel had passed it on the way in, it had been empty. Now someone was up there, a flashlight or a headlamp moving around, the faint sounds of equipment being unloaded, a tent being staked. Late arrival. It happened. Daniel gave it no more thought than that. He finished his coffee, added one more log to the fire, and climbed into his tent around 10:30. He was asleep within minutes. He woke up at exactly 2:11 a.m. He remembered the time because he reflexively checked his watch the moment his eyes opened, a habit from years of camping alone where knowing the time in the dark is a basic form of orientation. 2:11 a.m. The fire outside had burned down to embers. The forest was quiet, and for a moment Daniel just lay there staring at the ceiling of his tent, trying to figure out why he was awake. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The unmistakable sound of dry leaves compressing under weight. Not an animal. He knew what animals sounded like in the dark. The erratic stops and starts. The light, quick movements. This was different. This was measured, patient. The footsteps were moving around the perimeter of his campsite in a wide, careful arc, and as Daniel lay completely still inside his sleeping bag, hand already moving slowly toward the hunting knife he kept in the side pocket, the footsteps gradually tightened their circle, getting closer, closer, and then they stopped, directly outside the door of his tent. He said, the silence that followed was the worst part, because silence meant whoever was out there was just standing there, not passing through, not lost and stumbling around in the dark, just standing, stationary, right on the other side of a 3mm sheet of nylon. He could see, very faintly, the shadow of a shape blocking a sliver of moonlight that had been coming through the mesh panel at the top of his tent door. A shape consistent with a person standing upright. Daniel did not move. He did not speak. He gripped the knife handle and he breathed as slowly and shallowly as he could manage. His heart was hammering so hard he was genuinely afraid the person outside could hear it. 1 minute passed, maybe 2. And then the footsteps started again. Slowly, moving away from the tent door, getting quieter. And then they were gone. Daniel sat up in his sleeping bag with the knife in his hand, and he did not lie back down for the rest of the night. He sat in the dark, and he listened to the forest until the first gray light of dawn began showing through the tent fabric. Only then did he unzip the door and step outside. He told himself it had probably been another camper, someone who had gotten disoriented in the dark, wandered toward the glow of his dying campfire, realized it wasn't their campsite, and moved on. A reasonable explanation. A sensible explanation. He was a science teacher. He dealt in reasonable, sensible explanations. Then he looked at the ground near his tent door. Boot prints. Large ones, pressed deep into the soft earth. Not the prints of someone passing by. The depth and the placement told a clear story. Someone had been standing here with their full weight settled, stationary, for an extended period of time. And there was something else. Something that made Daniel's stomach drop in a way he said he never quite forgot. Around the boot prints, in a slow arc, were more prints, the same boots, circling the tent. Not randomly, not stumbling. The path was deliberate and smooth, like whoever had made them had been very comfortable moving quietly in the dark. Like they had done it before. The prints led back up the hill toward Campsite 9. Daniel spent a long time standing there in the early morning light, looking at those prints. He was a rational man, and he was having a genuine internal argument with himself. Half of him wanted to break camp immediately, get in his truck, and drive away without looking back. The other half, the teacher half, the methodical half, kept insisting there was a logical explanation and that he was catastrophizing. The methodical half won. He stayed. He spent the day hiking, trying to shake the unease that had settled into his chest like cold water. He pushed through 12 miles of trail, focused on his breathing, on the landscape, on the physical work of movement. By early afternoon, he had almost convinced himself that last night had been nothing. A wandering camper. A weird coincidence. He was fine. He got back to his campsite around 4 p.m., and the man from Campsite 9 was sitting at the bottom of the hill, on a fallen log at the edge of Daniel's clearing, watching. Not hiking past, not collecting water from the creek. Sitting. Watching Daniel's campsite, which was empty at the time because Daniel was still on the trail. The man didn't hear Daniel approach from behind until Daniel was about 30 feet away, and when he finally registered the footsteps and turned around, there was a fraction of a second, just a flash, where his expression was something Daniel struggled to describe later. Not surprise exactly. Something more controlled than surprise, like a person whose plan had been slightly interrupted and was quickly recalculating. Then the expression smoothed over, and the man just looked at Daniel with a flat, neutral face. Daniel raised a hand and said, "Hey." The man said nothing. He held Daniel's gaze for what felt like a very long moment. Then he stood up slowly, turned around, and walked back up the hill without a single word. Daniel stood at the edge of his clearing and watched him go. He described the man in detail, later. Late 40s. Very thin, the kind of thin that looks deliberate, maintained. Close cropped gray hair. Pale eyes, light blue or gray, that caught the afternoon light with an unusual clarity. He was wearing outdoor gear that looked almost too new. Stiff jacket, clean boots, a pack with no scuffs or dirt on it, like someone had bought the costume of a camper without actually being one. And he moved in a way that was very quiet for a man his size. Almost no sound as he walked up that hill. Daniel noticed that specifically. The man barely made any noise at all. Daniel was done talking himself down. Something was wrong. He could feel it the way you feel a change in the weather before it arrives, a pressure shift in the air. He made a decision. He was going to walk up to that campsite in broad daylight, introduce himself directly, and look the man in the eye. Because Daniel believed, and still believes, that most fear lives in the space between what you know and what you're imagining. A direct conversation would either confirm the danger or dissolve it. He hiked up to campsite 9:40 minutes before sunset, while the light was still good. The campsite was neater than he expected. A large tent, gray and expensive looking, a small folding table with a portable camp stove, fuel canisters arranged in a precise line. Firewood stacked with a precision that seemed excessive, each piece placed with care, ends aligned. A pair of boots sat beside the tent door, caked with dark mud that seemed fresh. A coil of rope hung from a low branch with the ends tied off, in a way Daniel didn't recognize. Not a knot he knew. The man was not there. Daniel called out a greeting. His voice went out into the trees and came back as silence. He waited. He called out again. Nothing. He was about to turn and leave when his eyes settled on the folding table and what was sitting on it. A notebook, lying open. He knew it wasn't his business. He was not the kind of man who read other people's private things. He looked away deliberately and took a step toward the trail, but something made him stop. Something he couldn't articulate then and still can't fully articulate now. He turned back, and he looked at the page. The handwriting was very small, very neat, and very cramped, the kind of handwriting that happens when someone is trying to fit a lot of information into a small space. He didn't read the whole page. He only allowed himself a few seconds before he looked away again, out of some stubborn sense of propriety. But in those few seconds, he absorbed enough. The page appeared to contain a list of names, first names only, written in a vertical column down the left margin. He counted 5 or 6 before he stopped looking. Next to each name were other notations, dates, abbreviations he didn't understand, short fragments of description. And next to one entry, circled in red ink, was a single word: Ouachita. Daniel closed the distance between himself and the trail in about 12 seconds and did not slow down until he was back at his own campsite. He packed his tent in under 6 minutes, which he said was a personal record. He loaded his truck in the dark using his headlamp. He drove 11 miles to the ranger station and walked in at 7:43 p.m. The ranger on duty, a woman named Brenda Kowalski, later confirmed that Daniel was visibly shaken, pale, speaking quickly, stopping to collect himself more than once. He told her everything: the boot prints, the man watching the empty campsite, the notebook, the list of names with that circled word. He told her he wasn't sure he had witnessed anything illegal. He told her he just had a feeling, a bad, specific feeling that he didn't know how else to describe. Ranger Kowalski filed a report, logged the campsite location, and radioed that a welfare check should be done at Campsite 9 the following morning. By the following morning, it was already too late. 2 rangers drove out to Campsite 9 the next evening. The tent was still there. The camp stove was on the table. The firewood was still stacked with that strange precision. The boots were still by the door, mud dried now and cracking. The coil of rope was still hanging from the branch. But the man was gone. The truck that had been parked at the trailhead lot, a dark green late model pickup that the rangers now confirmed had been there when they arrived, was gone. The notebook was gone. Inside the tent, investigators who arrived the following day found almost nothing: a sleeping bag, a flashlight, 2 protein bar wrappers. Whatever this man had come here with, he had taken most of it with him, almost most of it. In the far corner of the tent, tucked partway under the floor mat, a crime scene technician found a single photograph, a printed photograph, the kind you get developed at a pharmacy. It showed a hiking trail, a specific, recognizable trail in the Ouachita Forest, taken from a high vantage point looking down. In the far distance of the photograph, barely visible, was a lone figure walking the trail below. The photograph had been taken from above, from a concealed position, without the person in it having any idea they were being watched. The figure in the photograph was a woman. She was never identified. 16 days after Daniel packed up and left the Ouachita Forest, a missing persons report was filed in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A 34-year-old nurse named Carol Ashby had told her sister she was going on a solo hiking trip to the Ouachita National Forest on September 16th. She had texted her sister a photo of the trailhead sign when she arrived. That was the last communication anyone ever received from Carol Ashby. Her car was found at the same trailhead parking area where Daniel had parked his truck. Her tent and gear were never found. Carol was never found. Investigators pulled Ranger Kowalski's report within 48 hours of the missing persons filing. They found Daniel. He drove back to the forest and spent most of a day walking investigators through every detail he could recall. The boot prints, the circling pattern around his tent, the man on the log, the notebook, the list of names, that circled word. He walked them to campsite 9 himself and stood at the edge of it while the investigators moved around quietly, not saying much. The photograph found in the tent had already been sent to the FBI field office in Little Rock. In the weeks that followed, investigators from 3 states began quietly exchanging information. What they found, when they laid it all out together, was a pattern that nobody wanted to say out loud. Over the preceding 26 months, 7 individuals had been reported missing after solo hiking or camping trips in remote national forests across Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. 4 women, 3 men. No bodies had ever been recovered. No physical evidence had ever been found at any of the sites. The cases had no obvious connection and had been handled by different agencies in different jurisdictions. Nobody had been looking at them as a group. Now they were. Gerald Faust was 51 years old. He lived alone in a quiet suburb of Fort Smith, Arkansas, about 2 hours from the Ouachita Forest. He worked as a senior accountant at a mid-sized firm, had done so for almost 2 decades. He had no criminal record, not even a speeding ticket. His neighbors described him as quiet, polite, and forgettable in the way that some people are, the kind of person whose face you struggle to remember clearly even after you've spoken to them twice. A coworker, interviewed as part of a routine background canvass, mentioned something almost as an afterthought. She said that Gerald had started taking frequent long weekends over the past 2 years, Friday through Monday, sometimes longer. She said he had mentioned camping as the reason, which had surprised her because in 17 years of working together, Gerald had never once expressed any interest in the outdoors. She had thought it was a little strange but hadn't given it much more thought than that. Investigators went to speak with Gerald. He invited them in without hesitation. He offered coffee. He answered every question in a calm, cooperative, measured voice, making steady eye contact, occasionally pausing in a way that seemed thoughtful rather than evasive. He confirmed he had been at the Ouachita Forest campground that September weekend. He said the man who had approached his campsite, meaning Daniel, had seemed aggressive and confrontational, that he had felt uncomfortable and had decided to leave early. He expressed appropriate concern when told about the missing woman. He shook his head slowly when they mentioned the photograph. He said he had never owned a notebook like the one Daniel described. He said it calmly, without any particular emphasis, the same way he said everything else. Investigators found no physical evidence linking Gerald Faust to Carol Ashby or to any of the other missing persons. They could not place him at any of the other forest locations during the relevant time frames. The photograph from the tent had no fingerprints. The notebook was never recovered. Without evidence, they had nothing to take to a prosecutor. They kept the file open. They kept watching. Gerald Faust retired from the accounting firm in 2018. He sold his house in Fort Smith the following year and moved. Investigators noted the relocation. They noted where he moved to. It was a small town in rural Missouri, population 1,400, surrounded on 3 sides by national forest land. Carol Ashby has never been found. Neither have the other 7 individuals from the open case files. The photograph from the tent, a lone woman on a trail, shot from above without her knowledge, remains in an evidence file in Little Rock. Nobody has ever been able to identify her. Daniel Mercer still teaches science in Little Rock. He still camps. He goes with friends now, always with at least one other person, never alone. He keeps a knife in the side pocket of his sleeping bag just like always. He told a journalist in 2014 that the experience changed something in him that he couldn't quite put back to the way it was before. Not his love of the outdoors, He kept that. What changed was the easy confidence he used to have that if something felt wrong, there would be an obvious rational explanation waiting for him on the other side of it. Sometimes there isn't, he said. Sometimes you wake up at 2 a.m. and the thing outside your tent is exactly what you think it is, and the only thing that saved you is that it decided, for reasons you will never understand, to just walk away. He said he thinks about those boot prints sometimes, the depth of them, how long a person had to stand there to press that deep into soft ground. He thinks about what was happening on the other side of that nylon wall while he was inside, motionless, barely breathing, waiting. He thinks about what that person was waiting for too. And he said the most frightening part, the part that stays with him on quiet nights, is that he still doesn't know the answer. Neither do we.